No one stopped for the small boy by the fountain in Volunteer Park, his tiny shoulders shaking with silent sobs, his dark blue coat unbuttoned despite the biting Seattle wind. People glanced, then hurried past, as if his grief might somehow be contagious in the fading afternoon light. Catherine Hayes paused mid-stride, her waitress uniform partially visible beneath her worn beige coat, the book bag slung over her shoulder heavy with Russian literature classics. Her shift at the diner started in 20 minutes, but something about the abandoned child pulled at her heart more powerfully than the fear of being late. The boy couldn't be more than 5, with dark curls dampened by mist, his face flushed and tear-streaked as he stared hopelessly at the rippling water. Catherine approached slowly, kneeling down to meet his eyes, her voice softening as she spoke in gentle Russian, asking if he was lost. His crying stuttered to a halt, those piercing blue eyes widening with surprise that someone had addressed him in the language he knew from lullabies. His small hand reached out tentatively toward her, fingers trembling like autumn leaves about to fall. Behind the windshield of a black Bentley parked at the edge of the park, Dmitry Volkov's knuckles whitened against the leather steering wheel, his breath catching as he watched the unexpected scene unfold. The woman's Russian flowed with the musical quality that reminded him painfully of his late wife Irina. His men stood at attention nearby, hands inside their dark coats, eyes constantly scanning for threats, yet none had moved to retrieve his son. This strange woman had accomplished in seconds what his security team had failed to do for 15 minutes. Stop Alexei's tears. Who is she? Dmitry whispered, not expecting an answer from his stone-faced driver, his accent thickening with emotion as he watched his son tentatively reach for the stranger's outstretched hand. For the first time since the funeral 3 months ago, Alexei's face showed something other than blank desolation. The woman was nothing special at first glance, mid-20s perhaps, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing sensible shoes and a coat that had seen better seasons. Yet the gentleness in her movements spoke of someone comfortable in their own skin, unaware of being watched by the most dangerous man in Seattle. Alexei clutched the woman's fingers, his tears subsiding as she continued speaking in his mother tongue, crafting an impromptu story about the fountain being magical, guarded by invisible, friendly creatures. The transformation in his son's expression sent a jolt through Dmitry's chest, cracking something he'd thought permanently frozen. Pavel, his head of security, shifted uncomfortably beside the car, clearly uncertain whether to approach the civilian interacting with the boss's son. Dmitry held up one hand. Wait, his eyes never leaving the tableau of compassion playing out before him. Catherine smiled as the small boy's breathing steadied, his shoulders relaxing as she adjusted his coat buttons against the chill, retrieving the knitted hat from where it had fallen beside the fountain. Her practiced fingers brushed back his curls with natural tenderness before placing the hat gently over his ears. The decision crystallized in Dmitry's mind as he watched her smooth his son's rumpled coat with a casual affection that looked entirely genuine. Without taking his eyes off the pair, he spoke quietly to Pavel, his voice carrying the smooth, emotionless quality that made even hardened criminals tremble. Find out everything about her. Pavel nodded once, already reaching for his phone, knowing better than to question the command despite its irregularity. Dmitry stepped out of the car, his tall frame unfolding with predatory grace as he buttoned his impeccably tailored suit jacket against the wind, his expression carefully neutral. Catherine felt the shift in the atmosphere before she saw him, like the sudden silence before a thunderstorm, a prickling awareness crawling up her spine. She turned slowly, one hand still holding the boy's, to find a man approaching with the confident stride of someone who owned not just the ground beneath his feet, but everything his gaze touched. He was striking rather than handsome, with features carved from granite and eyes the exact shade of blue as the child's, though infinitely colder. The expensive cut of his suit couldn't disguise the lethal power contained in his movements, and Catherine instinctively pulled the boy closer, a protective gesture she immediately realized was a mistake. "Papa!" Alexei broke free from Catherine's hand, running to the imposing figure who knelt smoothly to scoop him up, murmuring something in Russian too low for her to catch. The transformation was immediate, the dangerous aura somehow softening around the edges as he checked his son for imaginary injuries. Catherine rose slowly to her feet, suddenly aware of several men in dark suits positioned strategically around the park, their attention focused entirely on her with unsettling intensity. She took an instinctive step backward, her waitress apron crinkling beneath her coat. The man approached with his son balanced effortlessly on one arm, his steps unhurried yet purposeful, radiating the quiet confidence of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. Up close, The expensive fabric of his suit and the subtle gleam of his platinum watch spoke of wealth beyond Catherine's comprehension. "You speak Russian to my boy," he stated, rather than asked, his English perfect, but tinged with a subtle accent that matched his son's. His gaze was analytical, assessing her as if she were a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. Catherine nodded, clutching her book bag a little tighter, the worn canvas scraping against her cheap coat. "I studied Russian literature at university," she explained, gesturing vaguely toward her bag, where dog-eared copies of Tolstoy and Chekhov jostled for space beside yesterday's tip money and half-eaten granola bar. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of something that surprised him. "You speak like a native," he observed, his tone neutral, yet somehow conveying that he was not accustomed to being surprised by anything or anyone. Alexei tugged at his father's immaculate collar, whispering something that made the man's expression shift minutely, a flicker of pain quickly masked. Without breaking eye contact with Catherine, he responded to his son in their shared language, his voice gentle in a way that seemed at odds with the hardness in his eyes. The diner's clock ticked in Catherine's mind. She would definitely be late now, and Mrs. Petrova wasn't known for her patience with tardy employees. "I should go," she said, taking another step back, suddenly eager to escape the intensity of his scrutiny and the unsettling attention of his men. "Your name," he said, the words somewhere between a request and a command, as he shifted his son to his other arm with casual strength. The little boy watched her with open curiosity now, his earlier tears forgotten in the mystery of this woman who spoke his mother's language. Catherine hesitated, then straightened her spine, refusing to be intimidated despite the warning bells clanging in her mind. "Catherine Hayes," she answered, meeting his gaze directly, her chin lifting slightly in unconscious defiance of the power imbalance between them. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, the gesture strangely formal, like a relic from another century. "Dmitri Volkov," he offered in return, his name hanging in the air between them like a weighted thing, though it meant nothing to her. Not yet. A sleek phone appeared in his free hand, materializing as if by magic, though she hadn't seen him reach for it. "Your number," he continued, holding the device toward her with the casual expectation of someone unaccustomed to refusal. Catherine blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of his request. "I don't give my number to strangers," she replied, the words escaping before she could consider their wisdom, her waitressing habit of setting boundaries with overly familiar customers kicking in automatically. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but the bemused recognition of someone encountering an unexpected obstacle in their path. The look vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a calculating assessment that made Catherine's skin prickle with awareness. "Then we should not remain strangers," Dmitri stated simply, as if solving a mathematical equation rather than navigating a social interaction. His free hand disappeared inside his jacket, emerging with a cream-colored business card embossed with a single silver wolf emblem. Catherine accepted it reflexively, the thick cardstock cool between her fingers, noticeably absent of any information beyond a phone number etched in elegant script. No name, no business, no explanation, just 11 digits that somehow felt more like a summons than an invitation. Alexei watched the exchange with solemn intensity, his small fingers playing with the silk of his father's tie, his earlier distress seemingly forgotten in the presence of this woman who shared his mother's language. His whispered request to his father was barely audible, but caused Dmitri's expression to soften imperceptibly. "My son would be pleased if you would join us for dinner tomorrow evening," Dmitri translated, though something in his tone suggested the invitation might have been embellished in the retelling. His gaze remained fixed on her face, studying her reaction with unsettling focus. Catherine glanced between father and son, caught between the natural instinct to decline such an unusual invitation and the genuine connection she felt with the tearful boy she'd comforted. Her fingers tightened around the business card, its edges pressing into her palm. "I work evenings at Café Morosco," she explained, naming the small Russian-themed diner where she'd picked up extra shifts to cover her mounting student loans. The coincidence of its Russian ownership suddenly struck her as significant rather than merely convenient. Something shifted behind Dmitri's eyes, recognition perhaps, or calculation, before he nodded once, decisively. "Then lunch," he countered, the word formed as a statement rather than a question, brooking no argument despite its polite delivery. Alexei's hopeful expression as he watched her from the safety of his father's arms tipped the scales of her decision. 1 hour, she conceded, already mentally calculating how she would explain this bizarre situation to her roommate, who had warned her repeatedly about her habit of collecting strays, both human and animal. The subtle curve of Dimitri's mouth couldn't properly be called a smile, more an acknowledgement of a minor victory in some game Catherine wasn't aware they were playing. He adjusted his hold on his son, the movement casual yet protective as the wind picked up around them. Catherine glanced at her watch and gasped at the time, all thoughts of strange men and their business cards temporarily forgotten in the face of imminent unemployment. "I really have to go," she blurted, already backing away, nearly tripping over her sensible shoes in her haste. Dimitri didn't attempt to stop her, merely inclined his head in that strangely formal gesture again, his eyes tracking her retreat with predatory focus. "Until tomorrow, Miss Hayes," he called after her, his accent wrapping around her name like silk over steel. She hurried away without looking back, unaware of how Alexei waved a small goodbye, or how Dimitri continued watching long after she disappeared around the corner. She was equally oblivious to the discreet nod he gave Pavel, setting in motion a machine of surveillance and investigation that would uncover every detail of her life before morning. Catherine arrived at the diner 17 minutes late, breathless and apologetic, expecting Mrs. Petrova's legendary temper to be in full force. Instead, she found the older woman unusually accommodating, mentioning something vague about an important call regarding Catherine's exemplary service to a valued customer. The coincidence nagged at her throughout her shift, a suspicion forming that perhaps the world was smaller than she'd realized, or that Dmitri Volkov's reach extended further than she could possibly imagine. Either way, she sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the quiet park by the fountain. Catherine awoke the next morning with sunlight streaming through her modest apartment windows and an unsettling awareness that something had changed. The sensation intensified when she spotted a sleek black car parked across the street, its tinted windows revealing nothing of whoever might be watching her building. Her roommate Zara looked up from her nursing textbooks as Catherine described the strange encounter in the park, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Volkov," Zara repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper despite their empty apartment. "As in the shipping magnate who supposedly runs half the criminal enterprises on the West Coast." Catherine laughed nervously, dismissing Zara's dramatic assessment as she prepared for her morning literature tutoring session at the community center. Surely the well-dressed man with the sad-eyed child couldn't be the crime lord featured in occasional newspaper articles about suspected trafficking and money laundering. The community center buzzed with its usual morning activity, elderly Russian immigrants gathering for their weekly cultural meeting, where Catherine volunteered teaching English. Mrs. Baranova, the center's director, pulled her aside with unusual urgency, eyes darting nervously around the room. "Someone made a very large donation this morning," she whispered, pressing a check into Catherine's hand for the literacy program she'd been struggling to fund. The amount made Catherine's eyes widen. $50,000, signed with a now familiar wolf emblem instead of a name. The coincidence felt too precise to be accidental, raising questions about how Dmitri had discovered her volunteer work overnight. More disturbing was how effortlessly he'd inserted himself into yet another aspect of her carefully constructed life, using wealth to create an obligation she hadn't asked for. Her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number as she was leaving the center. Car waiting outside. No signature, no explanation. Just the implicit assumption of compliance that made her bristle despite the flutter of curiosity in her stomach. A different black car idled at the curb, the driver standing beside the rear door with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. He nodded respectfully when she approached, opening the door to reveal leather seats and the subtle scent of expensive cologne. Catherine hesitated, one foot on the curb, suddenly aware of how little she knew about the man she was meeting. Zara's words echoed in her mind, along with every crime show warning about getting into cars with strangers, regardless of how well-tailored their suits or how sad their children's eyes. The driver remained impassive, neither encouraging nor discouraging her decision, his professional demeanor giving nothing away. After a moment's deliberation, Catherine slid into the back seat, telling herself she was simply honoring a lunch commitment rather than stepping into a world she didn't understand. The restaurant was not what she expected, not some exclusive establishment downtown, but a small, authentic Russian cafe tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, its windows steamed with the comforting aromas of borscht and freshly baked black bread. The elderly woman who owned it greeted Dmitri with obvious deference, leading them to a private corner booth. Alexei's face lit up when he spotted Catherine, his small frame wriggling with excitement as he abandoned his coloring book to scoot closer to her on the bench seat. The transformation from the tearful child in the park to this animated boy chattering in rapid Russian about his morning puzzles was remarkable. Dmitri watched their interaction with that same intense focus, saying little as Catherine engaged effortlessly with his son, drawing out smiles and giggles that seemed to surprise even Alexei himself. Only someone watching very carefully would notice how Dmitri's shoulders gradually relaxed, the line of tension in his jaw softening incrementally. The elderly owner returned with steaming plates of pelmeni and blini, dishes Catherine recognized from her studies, but had rarely tasted authentically prepared. Family recipe, the woman explained with a wink that suggested some deeper connection to Dmitri than mere restaurant patronage. When Alexei excused himself to examine the display of Russian candy by the counter, Dmitri's demeanor shifted subtly, leaning forward with the direct intensity Catherine was beginning to recognize as his natural state. "My son has not spoken so much in months," he observed quietly, his fingers absently turning his water glass in precise quarter rotations. Catherine sipped her tea, uncertain how to respond to the mixture of gratitude and calculation evident in his expression. "Children often find it easier to open up to strangers," she offered, though they both recognized that Alexei's response to her went beyond typical childhood curiosity. "You study Russian literature, work at a diner, volunteer teaching immigrants, yet live in an apartment with questionable heating and declining structural integrity," Dmitri stated, his tone making the observation sound like evidence being presented rather than conversation. "You graduated top of your class, but declined a doctoral scholarship to care for your ailing grandmother." Catherine set down her fork with deliberate care, the implications of his thorough knowledge of her life, raising alarm bells she could no longer ignore. "You've had me investigated," she stated flatly, meeting his gaze directly despite the unease crawling up her spine. His expression remained impassive, unapologetic in the face of her discomfort. "I have a 5-year-old son who hasn't smiled in 3 months, he replied simply, as if this justified any invasion of privacy. "Until yesterday, when a stranger spoke to him in his mother's tongue." Catherine glanced toward Alexei, who was carefully selecting candies under the fond supervision of the owner, his small face serious with concentration. "What happened to his mother?" she asked softly, though she suspected the answer from the shadows that occasionally crossed the boy's expression. Dmitri's fingers stilled on his water glass, his gaze momentarily distant. "Cancer," he answered, the single word holding volumes of unspoken grief. Irina fought for 18 months before Alexei lost her, and with her, his voice, at least in English. The revelation explained the boy's selective silence and his profound response to hearing Russian spoken with kindness. Catherine felt a surge of compassion for the child caught between worlds, between languages that now held such different emotional weights in his young mind. "I have a proposition," Dmitri continued, his business-like tone at odds with the personal nature of their conversation. "Alexei needs someone who understands his culture, his language, and his loss. A tutor who can help bridge his worlds while his regular school placement remains on hold." Catherine blinked, processing the unexpected offer. "You want me to tutor your son?" she clarified, watching his expression carefully for hidden motives or unspoken expectations behind what seemed like a straightforward request. Dmitri nodded once, decisive. 4 hours daily, 6 days weekly, at my home," he elaborated, naming a salary figure that made Catherine momentarily lightheaded. "The compensation includes benefits, transportation, and immediate student loan repayment." The mention of her student loans, her most pressing financial burden, confirmed that his investigation had been thorough indeed. Catherine felt a flash of indignation at having her financial struggles so casually exposed, even as practical consideration of the offer began calculating how many years of diner shifts it would eliminate. "I already have commitments," she countered, thinking of her waitressing job, her volunteer work, and the handful of private tutoring clients who barely covered her rent. "My schedule is quite full between my various positions." Dmitri dismissed this obstacle with a slight wave of his hand, as if her existing obligations were merely inconvenient details, rather than the careful balance that constituted her independent life. "Arrangements can be made to maintain your volunteer work," he conceded, clearly recognizing what mattered most to her. "The rest can be adjusted." Alexei returned to the table with a small paper bag of candies, his expression hopeful as he offered to share his treasures with Catherine. The simple gesture of childhood generosity contrasted sharply with the complex negotiation taking place between the adults. Catherine accepted a cherry-filled chocolate with appropriate enthusiasm, aware of Dmitri observing their interaction with that unnervingly focused attention. "Why me?" she finally asked, voicing the question that had been circling her mind since their strange encounter in the park. "Surely there are professional tutors with more experience." "My son responds to you," Dmitri stated with simple finality, as if this observable fact trumped all conventional hiring considerations. "He recognizes something in you that reminds him of his mother, not in appearance, but in essence." The comparison to a woman she'd never met felt strangely intimate, creating an emotional connection Catherine hadn't anticipated. She studied Dmitri's face, noting for the first time the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and the almost imperceptible worry that softened his otherwise intimidating demeanor when he glanced at his son. Catherine's first day at the Volkov mansion revealed more about her new employer than any background check could have told her about him. The sprawling waterfront property sat isolated behind high walls and state-of-the-art security, yet the interior felt unexpectedly warm, filled with books, art, and musical instruments that spoke of genuine appreciation rather than showy wealth. Alexei's playroom contained carefully selected toys that encouraged imagination and learning, many imported directly from Russia to maintain his cultural connections. Catherine noticed that Dmitri had preserved his late wife's touches throughout the home: fresh flowers arranged in specific vases, framed photographs in every room, and handwritten notes preserved under glass on certain bookshelves. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, their respectful demeanor toward Catherine suggesting they'd been thoroughly briefed about her role and importance. Mrs. Petrova from the diner made a surprising appearance as the estate's cook, offering Catherine a conspiratorial wink that explained her suspicious lack of protest about the abrupt job resignation. Dmitri's home office remained firmly off-limits, with armed security positioned discreetly nearby whenever he conducted business behind its heavy wooden doors. Catherine pretended not to notice the constant stream of serious-faced men who arrived for brief, intense meetings, their conversations falling silent whenever she passed by. Alexei flourished under Catherine's gentle guidance, his English slowly returning as they built trust through shared stories and games conducted in both languages. He spoke often of his mother, recounting memories that sometimes made Catherine wonder if Dmitri was listening from nearby doorways, his presence a palpable weight even when he wasn't visible. On rainy afternoons, they would sit in the library with steaming mugs of hot chocolate while Catherine read Russian fairy tales. Alexei nestled against her side in a way that felt increasingly natural. These peaceful moments contrasted sharply with the occasional tense phone calls that would summon Dmitri away at odd hours, his expression hardening into something dangerous that reminded Catherine of exactly who employed her. The incident with the broken vase occurred 3 weeks into her employment. A priceless family heirloom shattered when Alexei accidentally knocked it over during an enthusiastic demonstration of his new dinosaur walk. The boy froze in terror, his small body trembling as he stared at the ceramic shards scattered across the polished floor. Catherine reacted instinctively, pulling Alexei into her arms before he could step on broken pieces, whispering reassurances that accidents happen and precious things sometimes break. She was still holding him when Dmitri appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the destruction of what Catherine later learned had been his wife's favorite possession. Instead of the anger Alexei clearly expected, Dmitri knelt slowly beside them, gathering a few ceramic fragments in his palm with surprising gentleness. "Your mother broke this same vase when she was pregnant with you," he told his wide-eyed son, a small smile softening his features. "She said you were already dancing inside her." The revelation transformed the moment from potential crisis to shared memory, allowing Alexei to release his breath in a shuddering sigh as he leaned trustingly against Catherine's shoulder. Dmitri met her eyes over his son's head, something vulnerable and grateful in his gaze before his usual guarded expression returned. Later that evening, Catherine discovered a small box outside her guest house door, containing a fragment of the vase transformed into a delicate pendant, wrapped in a note written in precise Cyrillic script. Some broken things become more valuable in their new form. The gesture revealed a thoughtfulness she hadn't expected from the intimidating figure, who still conducted mysterious business behind closed doors. The boundaries between employer and employee blurred inevitably, as Catherine became more integrated into their daily lives. She found herself included in family dinners, weekend outings to the botanical gardens, and quiet evenings by the fireplace where Dmitri would sometimes read aloud from Russian classics, in a rich baritone that gave new dimension to texts she'd studied for years. Pavel, Dmitri's ever-present head of security, maintained a respectful distance, but watched her with increasing curiosity as his employer's demeanor subtly shifted in her presence. The staff exchanged knowing glances when Dmitri lingered over breakfast to discuss literature with Catherine, long after Alexei had finished his toast and wandered off to play. Catherine maintained professional boundaries with determined effort, reminding herself of the power imbalance between them and the temporary nature of her position. Yet she couldn't deny the growing warmth in Dmitri's previously cold eyes, or the way her heart accelerated when his fingers accidentally brushed hers while passing a book or teacup. The warning came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Petrova cornered her in the kitchen late one evening, her weathered hands gripping Catherine's with surprising strength. "You bring light back to this house," the older woman whispered urgently. "But you must understand who he is, what he controls, before your heart decides what your mind cannot change." Before Catherine could respond, security alarms blared throughout the mansion, red warning lights flashing as Pavel burst into the kitchen, gun drawn and expression grim. "Stay with the boy," he ordered tersely, already communicating through his earpiece as he ushered both women toward the reinforced panic room concealed behind the pantry. Catherine found Alexei already inside, clutching his favorite stuffed wolf as a security team member sealed the heavy door behind them. Through the small security monitors, she watched armed men move with practiced efficiency through the grounds, converging on a section of fence where something had triggered the perimeter sensors. Hours passed in the panic room's sterile safety, Alexei eventually falling asleep against Catherine's shoulder, while Mrs. Petrova murmured old prayers under her breath. The security monitors showed armed men patrolling in tactical formation, their movements precise and professional in a way that spoke of military training rather than typical private security. When the all-clear finally came, it was Dmitri himself who opened the heavy door, his pristine suit replaced by tactical gear, a thin cut above his eyebrow leaving a trail of dried blood down his temple. His eyes sought Catherine first, scanning her for any sign of distress before his gaze softened upon seeing his sleeping son curled trustingly against her. "Rival business interests," he explained vaguely, as he lifted Alexei from her arms, the tenderness with which he carried his son contrasting sharply with the coldness that had returned to his eyes. Catherine recognized the deliberate distance he was placing between them, a protective measure that felt more personal than professional. The following morning brought changes to the estate, additional security personnel, new surveillance equipment being installed, and heightened restrictions on movements beyond the property boundaries. Catherine overheard snippets of tense conversation about Baronov's crew and territorial expansions that raised questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Dmitri disappeared into his office for 3 days, emerging only for brief moments to check on Alexei before returning to intense discussions with grim-faced associates. The staff moved with heightened vigilance, exchanging worried glances when they thought Catherine wasn't watching. The newspaper delivered on the 4th day carried a small article about a warehouse fire at the docks that claimed 3 lives, described by police as a possible criminal dispute. Catherine's hands trembled as she folded the paper away before Alexei could see it, a cold certainty forming about Dmitri's prolonged absence and the fresh bruising on Pavel's knuckles when he returned to the estate that evening. Alexei sensed the tension despite everyone's efforts to shield him, becoming clingy and reverting to speaking exclusively Russian. During their reading session that afternoon, he suddenly asked in his mother tongue if the bad men were coming back, his small fingers clutching his wolf toy with white-knuckled intensity. Catherine chose her words carefully, aware that she knew neither the full truth nor what Dmitri would want his son to hear. "Your father has many people protecting you," she assured him, stroking his dark curls in the soothing rhythm that always calmed him. "This house is safe, and so are you." That evening, Catherine found Dmitri alone in the library, nursing a glass of amber liquid while staring into the fireplace, shadows deepening the lines of his face. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude on what was clearly a private moment of contemplation, or perhaps regret. He sensed her presence without turning, gesturing silently to the chair opposite his, with a weariness that seemed bone-deep. "You have questions," he stated, rather than asked, his voice rough from disuse or perhaps from giving orders she didn't want to imagine. Catherine settled across from him, the warmth of the fire doing little to dispel the chill between them. "Alexei asked me if the bad men were coming back," she said simply, offering neither accusation nor absolution, merely information about the child they both sought to protect. Something flashed in Dmitri's eyes, pain, or perhaps anger, before he set his glass down with deliberate control. "I built this life to protect him," he said quietly, the firelight casting harsh shadows across the planes of his face. Sometimes that requires difficult choices about who remains a threat. The implications of his words hung in the air between them, neither spoken directly nor denied. Catherine studied the man before her, the dangerous figure from newspaper whispers, merging with the devoted father who read bedtime stories and preserved his late wife's handwritten notes like sacred texts. "I should leave," Catherine whispered, though the thought of abandoning Alexei when he needed stability most made her heart constrict painfully. The ethical boundaries she'd once believed immutable seemed increasingly blurred by the genuine affection she felt for the child, and the complex emotions stirring whenever his father's gaze lingered on her face. Dmitri leaned forward, the movement bringing him into the firelight that revealed unexpected vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior. "If you go, he loses someone else he loves," he said simply, the words carrying no manipulation or threat, merely a father's concern for his son's emotional well-being. Catherine's decision to stay came with self-imposed boundaries, focusing exclusively on Alexei's education, while maintaining professional distance from Dmitri, whose business activities she deliberately avoided questioning. The strategy worked for exactly 2 weeks before reality shattered her carefully constructed compartmentalization. The invitation to Alexei's 6th birthday celebration arrived via embossed card rather than verbal reminder, the formality signaling something significant about the event. Catherine discovered that the small family gathering Dmitri had mentioned would actually include several dozen guests, including business associates and their families. Mrs. Petrova helped Catherine select an appropriate dress from the boutique delivery that arrived mysteriously at her door, the older woman's knowing eyes suggesting this level of attention from Dmitri held meaning beyond mere employer consideration. The midnight blue silk felt foreign against Catherine's skin, accustomed to practical cotton and sensible wool sweaters. Dmitri's expression when she entered the main house confirmed Mrs. Petrova's unspoken assessment, his conversation halting mid-sentence as his eyes tracked her movement across the room, something unguarded and appreciative flashing across his features before his usual composed mask returned. The intensity of his gaze sent warmth blooming across her skin, despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. The party guests represented a curious mix of legitimate business figures, political connections, and individuals whose careful scanning of exits and concealed bulges beneath tailored jackets suggested less reputable associations. Catherine focused on Alexei, who proudly introduced her to everyone as "my Catherine," with possessive affection that earned indulgent smiles from even the most intimidating attendees. She was supervising the children's craft table when the commotion began, raised voices at the entryway, followed by Pavel's urgent stride toward Dmitri, who immediately signaled his security team with subtle hand movements that sent them converging protectively around Alexei. The birthday guests parted as a man Catherine recognized from newspaper photographs entered, flanked by bodyguards. Gregory Baranov, Dmitri's chief rival in both legitimate shipping and rumored criminal enterprises. "Even you wouldn't bring violence to a child's celebration," Dmitri stated coldly, positioning himself between the newcomer and the room where Alexei remained oblivious, happily showing his new telescope to his friends. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as security personnel on both sides adjusted their stances, almost imperceptibly. Baranov's smile never reached his eyes as he held up empty hands in mock surrender. "I come bearing gifts, and congratulations only," he replied smoothly, though the predatory assessment with which he scanned the room suggested more calculating intentions beneath his apparent civility. Catherine felt someone gently but firmly guiding her toward the children's room. Mrs. Petrova, her expression grave as she whispered, "Stay with the little ones until this passes." The older woman's urgency conveyed volumes about potential dangers that might unfold in the main hall, despite the presence of children and civilian guests. Through the partially open door, Catherine could hear the two men exchanging words that sounded polite on the surface, but carried unmistakable undercurrents of threat and counter-threat. The conversation shifted to Russian, becoming more heated until Baranov's voice carried clearly. "Your weakness for family makes you vulnerable, Volkov. First your wife, now this American woman hovering around your son." The sudden silence that followed felt dangerous in its intensity, broken finally by Dmitri's voice, so cold and controlled it barely resembled the man who read bedtime stories and discussed literature over morning coffee. "Mention either of them again, and no power in this city will protect you from what follows." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, the implications of being specifically mentioned by Dmitri's enemy sending cold fear crawling up her spine. She forced herself to focus on the children, maintaining a calm facade while guiding them into a circle game that moved them further from the door and potential danger. When Dmitri entered the room 30 minutes later, his composed expression betrayed nothing of the confrontation, though the tight set of his shoulders spoke volumes to Catherine's increasingly attuned awareness of his moods. He joined the children's activities with apparent ease, though his eyes frequently swept the room with vigilant attention. That night, after the guests had departed and Alexei had fallen asleep surrounded by new toys, Catherine found Dmitri on the terrace, his silhouette stark against the moonlit water of Puget Sound. She approached quietly, offering the glass of vodka Mrs. Petrova had pressed into her hand with whispered instructions to take this to him. He needs it. He threatened you, Dmitri stated without preamble, accepting the glass without turning, his voice holding the same dangerous edge she'd heard during the confrontation. Baranov identified you as someone he paused, seemingly searching for appropriate terminology, as someone of value to this household. Catherine joined him at the railing, the night breeze carrying the scent of salt water and impending rain across the manicured grounds. I heard, she admitted, watching his profile tighten at her confirmation. Should I be afraid? Dmitri turned to face her fully, moonlight highlighting the stark angles of his face and the intensity in his eyes that had become increasingly difficult to dismiss as merely professional concern. Not while I draw breath, he answered with simple finality, a vow rather than reassurance. The implications of his statement hung between them. Not just protection, but something deeper, more personal than employer responsibility. Catherine studied him in the dim light, recognizing that somewhere between comforting a crying boy in the park and standing beside his father in potential danger, she had crossed invisible boundaries she'd once believed inviolable. I should leave Seattle, she suggested pragmatically, though the thought of abandoning Alexei and Dmitri created an unexpected ache in her chest. My presence puts both you and Alexei at risk if I'm being used to target your vulnerabilities. Dmitri's hand covered hers on the railing, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone capable of the cold fury she'd witnessed earlier. Running solves nothing, he stated with the confidence of someone who had likely faced similar decisions before. It merely changes the terrain of the battlefield. The undeniable truth hung between them. Her life had irrevocably changed the moment she knelt beside a crying boy and spoke to him in his mother's language. Whatever path she chose now carried consequences that extended far beyond her previous existence of diner shifts and literature classes. Catherine awakened before dawn to find Pavel standing outside her guest house door, his expression grim as he handed her a sealed envelope. Security footage from the property perimeter, he explained tersely. The boss thought you should see this before making any decisions. The photographs inside showed men in unmarked cars conducting surveillance of the estate entrance, with telephoto lens images clearly showing Catherine during her morning walks with Alexei. More disturbing were shots taken near her old apartment building and the community center where she'd volunteered, evidence that Baranov had been monitoring her movements even before the birthday party confrontation. Dmitri found her in the library an hour later. The photographs spread across the table as she tried to process their implications. You've been protecting me all along, she realized aloud, remembering the black cars that had appeared near her apartment after their first meeting, which she now understood had been security rather than surveillance. He neither confirmed nor denied her assessment, merely gathered the photographs with methodical precision. I protect what matters, he stated simply, the words carrying weight beyond their surface, meaning as his eyes met hers with unexpected openness. Catherine took a deep breath, recognizing the crossroads before her required full acknowledgement of truths she'd been avoiding. I need to know who you really are, she said quietly, not newspaper speculation or rival threats. The truth about what Alexei and I are part of. For a long moment, Dmitri remained silent, weighing her request against what appeared to be deeply ingrained habits of secrecy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she'd never heard before. I was born in Siberia during the collapse of the Soviet Union, when starvation claimed children daily, and criminal organizations provided the only functioning economy. The story unfolded between them, a brutal childhood transformed through intelligence and determination, legitimate businesses built alongside necessary shadows, a man straddling worlds to secure a future where his son might choose paths unavailable to his father. Catherine listened without judgment, recognizing the complex morality of survival that had shaped the man before her. When he finished speaking, the morning sun had risen fully, casting long shadows across the library floor. I have never lied to Alexei about who I am, Dmitri concluded, his gaze steady on hers. I will not lie to you either. There are parts of my business that operate outside legal boundaries, though I maintain certain principles that separate me from men like Baranov. Catherine processed his confession, measuring it against the man she had come to know, the father who preserved his wife's memory with devoted tenderness, who read Russian poetry with authentic appreciation, who valued education and kindness in a world that had shown him precious little of either. The contradiction wasn't really a contradiction at all, but a complete picture finally coming into focus. Alexei needs stability, she stated finally, making her decision based on the child who had worked his way into her heart with his resilience and vulnerability. And you need someone who sees you completely, not just the parts you show the world. Dmitri's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, hope carefully contained behind practiced control. And what do you need, Catherine? He asked quietly, the question hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. She considered the life she had built before meeting them, admirable in its independence, yet somehow incomplete in ways she hadn't recognized until experiencing the profound connection with both father and son. I need to know that whatever this becomes, she gestured between them, acknowledging the unspoken attraction that had grown despite her best efforts. It remains my choice, not an obligation or transaction. Dmitri closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat before his hand gently cradled her cheek. Your choice, he agreed, his thumb tracing her jawline with reverent care. Always your choice. The kiss that followed felt inevitable, not a beginning but a recognition of something that had been building since a tearful boy responded to her Russian whispers in a quiet park. Catherine's arms wound around Dmitri's neck as she surrendered to the connection that had transformed 3 separate lives into something neither of them had dared hope for, a family forged by choice rather than obligation. Later that evening, as they sat together watching Alexei demonstrate his new telescope in the garden, Dmitri's arm resting comfortably around her shoulders, Catherine realized that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings led to the most perfect endings. A whispered comfort to a crying child had somehow created the foundation for something beautiful and unexpected, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, a single act of kindness could illuminate a path toward love. Thank you all for following this story to its end. If you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who appreciates a good love story with unexpected twists. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to life for you each week.
А все равно, сути дела не меняет, как бы зарплата плюс-минус везде там, больше, чуть меньше. Как бы, и, наверное, это все, вот эта общая ситуация, наверное, у многих привела, во-первых, сфера развлечений, да, всякие там кредиты и так далее, настолько загоняют каждого в задницу человека. И об этом на самом деле никто так-то не говорит. Какое количество сейчас, допустим, даже в те же сложные времена такие, когда вот сейчас идет там специальная военная операция, да, где люди вообще умирают, в принципе, за какую-то сумму денег. То есть какая мотивация, то есть у мужика идти типа на войну, воевать и заработать денег? Потому что он вот в обычной жизни не понимает, типа, как реализовать себя. Он понимает, что он может пойти работать на какую-то работу, где зарплаты его все равно не будет хватать. Как бы тут тоже двойственная сторона. Хорошо, когда она есть, плохо, когда ее нету. Да, вот это маленькая даже зарплаты. Но морально-то ты все равно подавлен. Ты понимаешь, да, я там пойду туда, но как бы смысла мне этого не принесет большого. Да, у меня там станет, если я вообще не работаю и буду работать за 50 тысяч, хорошо, что они у меня есть, я смогу там покушать себе купить, но это же дизмораль. Когда ты заходишь в интернет и видишь, как люди там в Дубае летают, покупают себе огромное количество автомобилей какие-то, много всего такого, что ты за эту зарплату себе никогда в жизни позволить не сможешь. И как человеку оставаться морально типа сильным? Что ему нужно делать? Наверное, во-первых, это, наверное, все от семьи исходит, да? То есть, какая семья у тебя, как она построена. Если ты один живешь, это сложно, да, ты будешь сам себя, но у тебя опять-таки, возможно, ну, родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, ну, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такой вот. И эта борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? На вот это я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там Новстрой, задав ему этот вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку